Hi, and welcome to the Achieve Myself podcast. My name is Matthew Miniman, and this is episode 107, Game of Thrones Series 7. What can Targaryens teach us about insider threats? So, Targaryens, crazy motherfuckers. Just put that right up at the top. Targaryens are, or were, the rulers of Westeros before the events of Game of Thrones. King Aerys II is the Mad King, or was the Mad King before the beginning of the Game of Thrones. There was a rebellion. They overthrew him. He caused the rebellion because his son kidnapped the daughter of the Lord of Winterfell, Ned's sister, who, as the series starts, is the Lord of Winterfell. Anyway, that causes the Baratheon rebellion because Baratheon was betrothed to the Winterfell Lyanna Stark, and this caused the whole kingdom to sort of go in an uproar, because when the Starks went to go protest to the king, he just summarily executed them, burned them alive, and that caused the entire war. So he literally caused this uprising through his actions. He basically a self-fulfilling prophecy on his part. But that's kind of how the insider that's kind of how he acted and created his own problem, is that he just thought everybody was against him, so treated everybody against him. Eventually, everybody turned against him. That's kind of how that worked. But it is important to know that there were people who were actually against him from the beginning. I mean, there were several people who were attempting to overthrow the Targaryens, had always been trying to overthrow the Targaryens, and it's the entire, reason for, quote unquote, the Game of Thrones. It's not just the story of the book, it's the entire philosophy of the ruler of the King's Landing, is that it's the seat is always unstable, and it is impossible to remain on it for long. So, all that being said, insider threats in an organization are some of the hardest threats to combat against. And really, when we're talking about insider threats, there are actually three kinds of insider threats. There is a malicious actor. It is somebody who is, in fact, just working to cause harm to the organization. Typically, these are people who are either disgruntled or have become disenfranchised within the organization and are looking to cause damage because of some perceived slight. These folks are kind of easy to spot because they are always generated by activity within the organization, and generally there are warning signs that you can see. Not always, but generally. Then the second type of insider threat is the unknown. Like, I didn't know I was doing this. So it's somebody who is doing something unconsciously or not of their own volition. They're acting against the organization in a way that is kind of incidental. Maybe they think they're doing their job correctly, they're not. Maybe they think they're performing activities for a person or for leadership, and they're actually performing it for an outside person. That's the second kind. So you have sort of your purposeful insider threats, and you have sort of your accidental or unknowing insider actors or insider threats. And then the third kind is the direct outside hire coming in and basically performing action. So this is somebody who did not exist within the organization before they were hired. Once they are hired, they are immediately looking to steal or do whatever they can to take advantage of the organization. So those are the three kinds. And those are direct hired threats. They were a threat before they were hired, and then they they were a threat as they were hired into the position that they are in. And so those are sort of the three separations that we're looking at when we're talking about insider threats. And it is important to identify insider threats in this way, just because depending on what your organization is most vulnerable to, it changes how you should treat the potential for insider threat. And so there's a lot of different mechanisms and methodologies and thought process against insider threats. And unfortunately, there is no right answer here. So I can't just hand you a right answer. I can't tell you of a solution, but we can look at how to identify those and maybe how to better respond when we do find them, and possibly talk about at least combating the first two, because the first two are kind of directly defensible. And then the third one is actually a little bit harder, but still actually probably the easiest to defend against. So let's actually start with the third one. Let's talk about that outside hire that we bring in that is actively malicious as they start. We've seen this over the past few years pop up in a lot of organizations. The most famous where we know this happened is actually probably the KnowBe4 hack. KnowBe4 hired some developers from outside of the organization, basically sight unseen. They apparently were North Koreans posing as American citizens who had created deep fakes for their interviews and essentially just doing these remote interviews, doing these virtual interviews, were able to get hired. When KnowBe4 shipped the laptop was actually shipped to a laptop farm that somebody basically plugged in a Raspberry Pi into, and then a North Korean citizen was able to control that device from outside of the United States. And the only reason they found it is that they were doing some really weird things, basically claiming that they needed these tools installed that were appearing to be malware. When asked, the employee said, "Oh, my internet service provider told me to disable my firewall and antiviruses so that we could test to make sure that my internet connection was working." And then the security team rightly challenged that situation and basically understood that the organization's security software was being maliciously tampered with, and responded, investigated, and then pulled the laptop and found this out and basically got the FBI involved. Now the FBI has actually closed several of those laptop farms that are being used for this purpose, and everybody's sort of on a higher alert for this sort of thing. But in general, so this KnowBe4 is not a small company. And like I said, this is probably the most famous circumstance for this. If you're listening to this podcast now in 2025 or in the near future, you're probably not working for a Fortune 500 company. You probably don't have billions of dollars in resources or gross profit or gross income or even gross dreams at the moment. So a lot of the functionality and affordability of who you can hire is probably outside of the realm of what KnowBe4 would. But a lot of people, because of organizations now, because of how distributed our workflow can be, a lot of organizations are looking to hire people out from outside of their normal hiring range. Classically, organizations hire those people who are near them. You can come into the office, we can do interviews, I can know you're a person by just the virtue of you showing up into the office, so on and so forth. So now, today, that's not possible because a lot of people are hiring remote workers, which is fine. I actually 100% would prefer 100% work from home. It's great. It's fantastic. It's a great benefit for people. But from a security perspective, there are a lot of challenges to this. And specifically with the hiring process, when we're talking about insider threats, it can be a challenge because most organizations do something like a background check where they investigate the the prospective new hire, new user for criminal activity, and they may even do a credit check and try to identify any sort of suspicion with the user or this person that they're looking to hire. The problem is that information, one, can be faked, and two, is only a surface level check and is really not going to give you all of the data that you might need to determine if somebody is fake or not. The unfortunate thing that I have to say is that there is no real good replacement for on-site, face-to-face interviews. There really is no replacement there. Now, that's not foolproof because somebody can send an actor to you to then begin a conversation. But I would say that the best methodology, the best verification method to combat this is to have several interviews, and a combination of virtual interviews, phone interviews, and live interviews where you have people involved every step of the way for all three interviews. So you have the same person. So if the individual that shows up to the physical interview is different than the person that was on the virtual interview, that can be identified by this person, by the interviewee or by the interviewers. That also being said, it is important for you as an interviewer to make sure you ask questions that are consistent across these interviews so that somebody can't just make something up. So they can't just easily pass by or pass through these interviews. One of the things that we've found as we've been hiring people in my business today is that there are a lot of people who will tend to, because we do a lot of remote interviews, virtual interviews, we have people when we ask a question, they'll be like, oh, blah, blah, blah. They'll start talking and you can tell they're kind of searching for an answer and they're actually just typing the answer into AI. And then you can read the answer to the question we've asked them from AI. And you can tell because AI, it does not sound like a person and these people are fucking dumb. So they don't know how to say the words in a way that doesn't sound like AI. And that is a challenge as well. Anyway, whole point being is that during the interview process, you should be doing a deeper job in making sure that the people you're hiring are the people that are actually going to be doing the work. And part of that is also with the know before compromise or hack or whatever you want to call it, this insider threat, this insider that was hired that was from North Korea. This individual, the red flags were that they requested that the interview be performed on a specific platform because Teams and Zoom didn't work on their computers. And it is suggested, when you have an interview platform, you'd be like, well, if you can't do this interview on Teams, then you can't do the interview. And that should be it. Like if they can't operate within your normal interview scheme, then yeah, it's probably not worth it to continue on that. And I understand that some businesses like, hey, we can't hire talent, so on and so forth. Maybe be a little bit more discerning about the people that you're hiring and the talent that you're hiring. Don't just hire anybody. Kind of goes without saying. Anyway, that's also, Targaryens, if they had been more choosy about who they had hired for their Kingsguard, maybe Aerys wouldn't have been killed by Jaime Lannister because, he killed Aerys during the battle for King's Landing and could have taken the throne. But yeah, he was hired as Kingsguard and stabbed Aerys literally in the back. So yeah, maybe be a little bit more careful who you're going to hire. Yeah. So then the other two types of insider threats, those that are of the two, the malicious insider, the one that's created through action or knowingly doing things against the company. These insiders are difficult to plan against because or difficult to prevent because you don't know what's going to set somebody off. And also, every organization is different. So, if your mission is to do something and you go against that mission and that causes angst and anger within your organization, that's a problem. You also can't prevent people from talking to others outside of the organization. And if somebody decides, hey, I can get paid more by stealing company secrets, sometimes they'll do that. But the best way to combat these insider threats is there's a lot of things. So on the prevention side, this is not something that I can tell you as an organization how to prevent, unfortunately. This is a concept that the military and CIA, they try to make sure they hire people who aren't susceptible to this sort of thing, who are always going for the mission, so on and so forth. And they do a lot to leverage, honor and patriotism to make sure that to keep people kind of in line. I'm sure they do a lot more than that, but for the most part, those are kind of the traits that they look for. They look for people who are blindly devoted to the organization, whether it be the United States or the agency that they're going to be a part of. So unfortunately, and they still see insider threats like this. So even that's not perfect. So combating this is difficult, so preventing it is difficult, rather. Combating it, there's a lot of different layers that you can put into place. One of the most important things that you can do, and we've talked about this briefly, I don't think I've actually covered it in a full episode, and I will eventually, is the principle of least privilege, or PULP. PULP, principle of least privilege, is the idea that you only give the permissions necessary for somebody to do their job. This can be done through a variety of methodologies. You'll hear role-based access control. You'll hear mandatory access control. You'll hear discretionary access control. And these are all different control methodologies to basically allow for principle of least privilege. And the end result being that you only give those permissions in the instant they are needed, necessary, and then that is the only time that those permissions are ever given. Like, you don't just have persistent permissions out there. You don't just give anybody anything they want. The principle of least privilege identifies what somebody needs, gives it to them, and then removes any additional access that they may get, because that is how a lot of insider threats are able to be performed, is because there is inherent trust with users, especially users who have a specific level of trust. They're given more trust, and therefore that causes that causes a breakdown in the security and access control system, because then they're able to bypass certain things. And this is the entirety. This is also the entirety of how social engineering attacks are leveraged. They're leveraged because people are often given more permissions than are necessary. And when a user can do things that they probably shouldn't be able to do, and they don't quite understand what they're doing, that can be dangerous. However, an insider malicious threat like this, where somebody is actively looking to harm an organization that they're working within, if they have more permissions than they should, that's going to be an avenue where they can leverage this sort of attack and gain access that they shouldn't have, perform actions against the company that are harmful, and have a greater amount of damage. So enforcing principle of least privilege is important. Another thing that will combat this is something called rotation of responsibility, or job rotation. Make sure that somebody isn't always doing one thing all the time. Make sure they haven't set up any mechanisms where they are siphoning off funds or siphoning out data that are reliant on them maintaining the position that they have. Always enforce job rotation where possible. Now, this isn't something that's really possible for smaller organizations, but it is important to do the next part, which is forced time off. Make sure that people are taking time off. Aside from the fact that work-life balance is a fucking thing and that you should be forcing people, or that people should be 100% willing to take time off to get away from their fucking job. Sorry, I'm passionate about work-life balance again. Anyway, the whole point is that with forced time off, you are creating a place where somebody else can detect that there is something, a mechanism in place that is harmful to the business, harmful to the organization. So as somebody else is doing that job, they can get trained to do it. They can see what's being done and hopefully see any sort of incidents where somebody set up a mechanism or task that is harmful to the business. So job rotation and forced time off, they kind of do the same thing, but it is important to do those things where possible and where available. Another thing to make sure of insider threats is that highly sensitive activities or highly sensitive operations are performed in a dual key or multi approval methodology. So dual key meaning the classic storyline where in order to launch the nuke or open the door, there are two locks that have to be turned at the same time, two keys used by two different people in order to open the door or launch the nuke or whatever. There has to be some sort of dual confirmation there. So always put those highly sensitive, highly damaging, highly risky activities behind some sort of dual approval process. So somebody can't just push through a potentially harmful action themselves. And another thing to help combat the malicious activity is don't just put anybody in positions of trust. Make sure that positions of trust are held by people who are trustworthy. Make sure that you identify those people and that you hold on to them and that you try to keep them happy. I would argue the best thing you can do to prevent a malicious insider threat is to make sure people are happy with what they're doing. It's not always the case. You can't always prevent malicious insider threats like that, but you can do the best you can. Yeah, trying to keep people happy. Honestly, if King Aerys had not been a terrible person and murdered hundreds and hundreds of people and threatened to kill the entirety of King's Landing, maybe he wouldn't have been stabbed in the back and destroyed, and the rest of the Targaryen household put into hiding. So, maybe he should have thought about that before, doing such a terrible job of being a king. I don't know. Maybe all kings are bad. Maybe. Who knows? Anyway, moving on to the third type of insider threat, those that are unknowing. So this is real difficult because insider threats, like, how do you combat these on an alternative side? Like, how do you really, the only way to stop these is on the preventative side, unfortunately, because the way to prevent this on the other side is to kind of remove the ability for anybody to do anything at all, which is kind of as a security professional, cool. If I could turn off all computers, yeah, they're secure when they're turned off. Too bad work can't be done. So yeah, that's kind of the end all be all of that solution is you can prevent a lot of activity by reducing them. But with the previous two, just like with the previous two, making sure you're hiring people who who you're hiring and making sure you provide the principle of least, or you establish the principle of least privilege across your organization, that will help in this third type, this insider threat, this unknowing, accidental, incidental insider threat. That'll help prevent it, or at least prevent damage from it. Now, to prevent it, prevention is the key to this one. Prevention is kind of really the only option for us, because we have to, as administrators, security practitioners, or IT professionals, we have to make sure that that users are given the tools to identify either when they're being taken advantage of or when they are being compromised themselves. So as a practitioner, as a IT manager, as an IT professional, you should be looking at ways to prevent user activity that could be harmful to the organization as just sort of an incidental process. So removing the ability for people to operate as administrators within the organization, removing full control rights from file permissions or share permissions, removing anyone permissions from files where necessary. Those are a lot of the steps that you can take as an organization to simply remove some of the ability of an attacker or a malicious entity to cause your users to do something harmful. But even then, that's not going to be totally the case, because a user can totally do stuff on their own that can fuck over the organization. They can accidentally perform activities that transfer money out of the organization. They can make mistakes, so on and so forth. These are all threats that the organization faces, and they all come from inside. So more over than a lot of the technical controls that you can provide, training is key. Make sure that your people are properly trained. That should go without fucking saying, but unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't seem to understand that if they train their people properly, they will have fewer incidents of insider threat and insider attack. And when I say train, I don't just mean train them in their job. Also, train them in cybersecurity. Make sure they understand what threats face them. Make sure they have the opportunity to reach out and give identification of information, and make sure they feel compelled to ask questions. One of the hardest things for an organization to do is to empower their people to ask a question. If they can do that, they can make sure that anytime something odd happens or something off happens, their people are raising a question and potentially preventing an insider attack that they would have caused otherwise. So that's kind of how you can combat a lot of this, is through that training, through controls. But the other thing that you can do to make sure that insiders are not accidentally or incidentally causing issues is to make sure that you have a standard in place where you can see what people are doing. Again, non-repudiation, which we've talked about in the past, the concept of the logs identify that you have done this activity, and because we know you did this activity, we know this was you, we know where this information came from. We log the information, we identify the people who are doing it, we can be alerted as soon as it's done. Being alerted and aware of what's going on inside of your environment can also be the key to stopping insider threats, whether they be actively malicious, incidental, or somebody coming in from outside of the organization to do something malicious to your company. Making sure you have adequate logging and adequate alerting is key. So, all that being said, if Aerys Targaryen had done any of these, he might have been able to prevent himself from being killed, stabbed in the back in the War of King's Landing, in the War of Fire. I forget what it's called, and I'm too lazy to look it up, because guess what, guys? This is my last episode in this miniseries. I'm sure you guys were really tired of this. I got tired of it at the end, but it was cool. It's a neat experiment. There will be more miniseries as we move on, and I hope that we can find some other cool, fun, silly, random shit to talk about. Yeah, here's looking at next week, and I hope you all have a great day.